You've said that sometimes slowing down AI development is like slamming on the brakes to avoid crashing. I think we're at a moment right now in the industry where the brakes are nowhere in sight and people are really just like trying to go as fast as possible.
Every CEO wants to be able to wake up and talk to the chatbot and get access to absolutely everything going on in their organization. Ultimately, neurosymbolic AI is where the human view of how things are that a person can understand and how an AI model operates come together.
People don't want to encode all of their tacit knowledge and then lose their jobs and be kind of automated away.
I think with AI, the goal is to free up as much time as possible to focus as much as possible on the human aspects of the role.
Hey everyone, and thanks for tuning into another episode of The Chief AI Officer. Today, I'm speaking to Nicholas Clarke, who goes by Nicky Clarke, who is the Chief AI Officer at Intelagen and Alpha Transform Holdings. Nicky, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Ben, for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, you've done a lot of work on AI governance, implementation, compliance, all of those fun topics that people often try to avoid, but that are key to effective rollout. So I'm excited to get into all those topics today. Before we do that, can you give our audience just a brief intro to, who is Nicky and some of your background?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I have been leading AI for Intelagen for a little over a year now. I had spent a stint as a partner in the AI strategy practice at Wipro, as well as their sustainability and Microsoft partnership practices. My focus prior to Wipro was HCL, where I led their Microsoft practice. Both of those practice leadership roles were in financial services focused vertical. I got my Microsoft chops at Microsoft, where I spent 6 years as an account global technology strategist, focused on large professional services enterprises like PwC. I spent about 7 years prior to Microsoft at Deloitte Consulting in their tech strategy and architecture practice. Got a lot of experience with financial services, mergers and acquisitions, and enterprise architecture. And then I started out in my own consultancy in 1999 and ran that for about 10 years, focused on the state of Florida and large-scale government projects. So I'm based in Orlando, Florida currently, and I did spend about 11 years in New York City, where I still have my heart. So.
Well, that speaks to me, given that I'm in Brooklyn and New York. But it sounds like you have had a lot of experience with integrating these systems for large companies, both on the consulting side, and, at Microsoft, where you're probably very much on the front lines helping these companies deploy at scale. I'd love to get into, some of the things that you've already spoken about more publicly. I think good place to start, right? You've said that sometimes slowing down AI development is like slamming on the brakes to avoid crashing. I think we're at a moment right now in the industry where the brakes are nowhere in sight and people are really just like trying to go as fast as possible. And it feels like some of the governance, compliance hurdles, some might call them, or kind of essentials, other people might call them, right, are getting forgotten a little bit.
Right.
What's the biggest AI crash that you see coming if we don't hit the brakes? And what do you mean by a statement like that?
Well, I feel ultimately that we can't ignore strategy generally when we are implementing technologies and transformative technologies, especially. Strategy really has to do with not only defining your target and what you're trying to become, but it's also the path to get there in a way that operates on a number of dimensions. Risk management is one of the largest dimensions that we need to consider when it comes to being able to transform with systems or technologies or any sort of process transformation. I feel like there's a lack of formalization in the development of appropriate risk management strategies as part of an AI transformation in a lot of organizations. Those would require the bringing together of key leaders across the organization, including compliance, the risk growth officer type leaders, to ensure that contingency and mitigation plans are in place. Many of the types of contingency and mitigation plans would inform us to implement governance and ethical technologies when it comes to tech and process changes that have to do with human transformation or decisions or anything that is significant in a business outcome. And so for me, it's really about not just responding to the CEO demands to have the global chatbot of their dreams, which is, typically the largest program of work that I've seen enterprises running toward when it comes to this kind of accelerated AI. Every CEO wants to be able to wake up and talk to the chatbot and get access to absolutely everything going on in their organization. And while that's a formidable goal, often those types of large-scale programs really need to be thoughtfully done in such a way as to ensure that there's value, that there's a low risk, and that there's high business outcomes across the organization, across stakeholders. So total stakeholder management is also an area that I think has been underserved when it comes to the accelerated view of AI. And that really includes looking across not only your customers and employees, but your regulators, the business operation regions that you operate in, and the concerns of the general populace around which your business derives its assets or its operating model.
And in terms of a company getting all those things wrong, what happens to a company in that scenario, right? What does poor governance and a crash look like in terms of impact to the organization?
Well, I mean, the crash is the key word there. I mean, ultimately, any aspect of a governance program that is ignored leads to potential risks of, downside problems, whether it's, biases that are incorporated into your Vision AI program that ultimately result in, large class action lawsuits, which has happened in the fairly recent past to a couple of large, drug what are they called? Pharmacists and retail centers. But ultimately, it's really about avoiding the pain of having to be exposed for lack of maturity in the implementation of governance and controls generally. When you get into areas of decision making that typically were done in a methodical way by a series of humans, and you allow a stochastic model to ultimately automate the process of decisioning, you run into additional vulnerabilities when it comes to litigation and ultimately causing potential harm to your end users or customers of your system. So I think the first rule is do no harm generally, right? And ultimately get high quality outcomes for as broad of a collection of stakeholders as possible. Focus on your employees, your customers, your regulators, maybe in that order.
Yeah, you said the magic word that so many people on this podcast use, which is stochastic systems, right?
Right.
I think large organizations in particular are scared of stochastic systems, of solving decision-making problems with probabilistic systems, particularly as they get more complex, they get more unreliable, the risks become much, much larger. What we used to see in the industry was this very robotic process automation, all of those like decision flow systems, very constrained, very kind of if this, then that deterministic logic type systems. Agents introduce a new level of complexity into that is very concerning for large companies. It seems like part of your solution to that is something like nano governance, right? Or like dealing with those governance within smaller frameworks versus the entire organization. Am I understanding that right? Or how do you think about nano governance, and why does that help?
Use that. I've coined that term maybe 18 months ago as a way to understand the decomposition of governance control frameworks into the smallest operationally implementable module that can be applied to systems. And so to me, it's really about taking your governance controls, which are typically aligning to your policies, which are based on your strategy and your regulations and your commitments, and turning those into actionable moments within a business operational process that can then be applied to a system that executes that operation. Even in the stochastic world, it's really about having the appropriate modularity within the end-to-end process, where parts of it might be deterministic and parts of it stochastic, but that ultimately you're controlling the ins and outs of those components within those modules to ensure compliance with those policies, those ultimately the regulations and the strategies that you're trying to make real with your automation. I would say too, though, that there has been statistically aligned rules systems for a long time that aren't. So it's not that there isn't statistical based workflows that aren't 100% traceable. That's been there for a while, but we have that kind of at another order of magnitude when we're asking foundation language models to do things and make choices and to advise on aspects of a business process. And so when you have controls and examples and kind of templates essentially that align to your expectations of the input and output of any of these kinds of modularized process automation systems that include AI, that then you can ultimately have a higher degree of confidence in that system, and be able to kind of do root cause analysis when there is the need to drill into and understand where systems fail, and that has to be implemented, end to end, not just in your production system, but also through the entire life cycle of the development of these types of solutions, so that ultimately your DevSecOps, your AI ops, your ML ops all leverage these types of modular control frameworks, so that development of these systems is done in this kind of thoughtful way. And I think just because of this, in your first question, that kind of this urgency companies feel to become AI oriented and AI first, they are abandoning some of these more rigorous methodologies and approaches, which have served large scale transformations very well in the past. And they're going to feel the pain from that. I feel, in the end, ultimately having to go back and rework or abandon programs and projects because of this lack of maturity in the implementation of governance. The nano aspect of it is really about getting to the finest possible operational unit of a control in a process workflow, and it's really trying to inspire the systemization of governance through governance control technology systems that allow for you to map governance frameworks to your systems themselves. So it's kind of an architectural approach to decomposing things down to their smallest unit of what can be controlled.
Yeah, I have two questions. One would be to walk the audience through an example of what that would look like, where you're using different elements of that nano governance framework. The other question is a broader question. What we're seeing a lot in the industry right now is there was this huge promise with LLMs of people getting very excited of the agentic possibilities, let's say, of letting LLMs loose on their decision-making frameworks and having that dream of not having to define everything in a deterministic way and having it solve complex problems. The reality that I'm seeing with both large companies and the startups that are building for them or with them is that most value is in the constraining of these systems, like the application of very domain specific problems, a ton of context engineering, as well as just the prompt engineering aspects. Often what I'm seeing is this push and pull between there is tons of value that can be created, but to a point where you're constraining the LLM so much that in some cases you're also even wondering why use the LLM in the first place. And so I'm curious where you see that balance happening as people start to build. Is nano governance a way of kind of addressing some of that, or does it still require like this very kind of breaking down a complex chain into very specific components and then controlling it at each aspect of that? I'd love to hear you speak to that.
Well, when you don't have a model that is a robust and decomposed view of your business domain, you're essentially using context engineering or prompt engineering to encourage the language model to develop its own model. So when the language model takes your input, it's making sense of it, and it's building its own, essentially a graph neural network that makes sense to it based on the totality of the information that you've provided in terms of the context and the prompts, plus its vast corpus of this foundation model information that it's drawn from. Oftentimes, that's extremely sufficient for low risk types of actions and outcomes from applications that are developed. And agents are just applications, right? And where you need to consider really taking your view of what your business strategy is, your constraints, your regulatory commitments, and embedding them in such a way as to have the model always refer to them and ensure that its outputs are constrained by them, so that ultimately that outcome is within the parameters of what you want in terms of your risk. So what I've been really preaching about for about 18 months now is the leveraging of different types of graph technologies in order to implement both in the development of your app, your model, and the usage of that model in production, and the assurance that outcomes are aligned to your ultimate goals. And so what that operationally means is developing a very robust series of knowledge graphs, essentially, that define your current state of operations, your current regulatory regime, operational controls that are required for the different kinds of business processes that are of high value to you. And with that kind of model, that language, you're able to then fine-tune models in the process of ensuring that a large language model understands all of that in your context, is baked into the model, to incorporate that into the prompts for prompt fine-tuning, incorporate that into your series of checks and balances within the app itself, implement things like graph RAG to ensure that the outcomes are mapped ultimately to a control in such a way as to pass that control's parameters. And so a lot of times these things are seen as an afterthought and look to be bolted on later, but it really needs to be part of your development lifecycle, so that ultimately every aspect of the system can be thoughtfully developed in such a way as to be very differentiated in yours, executing both on your strategic outcomes that you're trying to deliver on, but also within the constraints of your governance framework. And so what that ends up meaning operationally is that you have to take the time to model your organization in such a way that it's accurate and can be managed and updated. So this is where the rise of ontologists, you might have seen, in the past year or so, a lot more conversation about ontologies as a foundational model of a model, essentially, that allows you to create these knowledge graphs of companies within the different lines of business and bring them all together with an ontological view of that company within the context of its industry. What that lets you do is to really evolve your graphs of how your company operates very thoughtfully based on different domain ontologies. This is a thing that companies at a high maturity level are doing well. And ultimately, you're trying to take your view of the world in a graph structure and say to this large language model, which sees the world in this monster huge graph, and say, this is the way we are, and everything you do needs to conform to how we operate in order to achieve our outcomes and to stay within our constraints. And so that has to be done in a way that basically creates a business unit within the organization that models the company, that maintains those models, and that serves those models up to the tech teams, to the business domain teams, and ensures that they're accurate, they're updated, and that they're available for the implementation within the AI and agentic life cycles. It's a lot to ask for small startups, mid-sized businesses, but the enterprise sector really needs to step up. This is where they should already have, knowledge graphs and be using them, but it's not something that they've seen as valuable. So trying to build that muscle kind of late in the game is going to be a bit of a challenge for them. And so in the world of ontologies and graph companies, there's been quite an uptick and some mergers of companies that have ultimately resulted in options now to have enterprises come in and acquire that knowledge and build up their muscle around this.
That was a very good description of a lot of those problems and the solutions for them. So thank you for that. I was smiling through a lot of it because my previous company worked in neurosymbolic AI and was very much involved in the merging of graph structures and ontologies with large language models. What I find to be particularly interesting, to your point, right, about there is this strong demand right now for the operationalization of kind of large language models within large companies to get those strategic outcomes. But that foundational work of the knowledge graph hasn't been done. And trying to convince people within those companies of the value and the need for the knowledge graph is difficult in a market where there is so much hype and they just kind of assume, well, why can't the large language model just solve this for us?
Right.
I feel like that makes this conversation difficult. How have you found the, I guess, feedback to that pitch or just like that view of the world? Are you seeing a lot of, is that resonating with the people that you're speaking to build out these systems?
I think it is. Well, you got to really kind of explain one of the terms that I've really come to enjoy. One of my colleagues, Allende Kemp, got his PhD in business management, and he coined the term situational AI. And situated AI is really about how do you differentiate your business when everyone has access to the same foundation models. And so when you're asking the model itself to, on the fly, come up with what it assumes to be your operating constraints and your strategy, even in a very robust prompt and context developed, system prompts, it's really making a very educated guess, right? Educated on millions of documents and books and, content, but it's not human informed by your senior leadership. And I'm glad you mentioned neurosymbolic AI. I mean, ultimately, that's where I'm headed with these concepts. I mean, ultimately, neurosymbolic AI is where the human view of how things are that a person could understand and how an AI model operates come together. And that's really what we're talking about. It's how do we bring these things together in a way that doesn't slow down innovation, but actually increases innovation, because within the constraints, you can innovate more freely because you know that you can pump out more outcomes faster because you have, there's no holes barred, essentially. You have the boundaries, the rules of the game, and you can run with it. Without it, you're going to be bumping into walls potentially, whether it's language model constraints or legal constraints, and learning through the school of hard knocks, which isn't necessarily the best way to operate. What I've found is that there's limited ability for middle managers to create this kind of accelerated motion toward creating this kind of neurosymbolic graph structure necessary for these outcomes, because they're ultimately operating within one domain of the business, and it has to be seen as a burning platform for the most senior leadership in the organization, so that they can understand that this is the way to both differentiate strategically, but also to retain their strategic edge when it comes to risk management and not failing through having an uncontrolled system process. And so when they understand that, I think that there's a lot of other benefits to this type of a view. But those kind of key elements are how they can then differentiate from their competitors that are all essentially accessing the same collection of these foundation models that are there. And when you do have that kind of view of your organization that's well modeled, that gives you advantages then in not having to use the largest foundation models, that you're pushing a lot of this, just-in-time modeling to, right? Essentially, you can use the smaller models and get a lot of value out of them because you're creating the parameters within which they can operate in a way that conforms to your strategy and your risk posture.
Yeah, I love that answer because there's a lot of talk in the industry right now about context engineering and the importance of having your business data applied to the model when it's solving issues. But you're pushing that further and suggesting that, the ultimate context is the knowledge graph that you can provide the model to some extent. And that it's then rooted in your business, and it is highly differentiated versus a technology that everybody has access to. And so where is the competitive advantage of just building on top of that model, even if it's slightly fine-tuned? I think the knowledge graph does become such a key component of that. And I think you've already outlined how agentic AI systems in that world won't necessarily break the law, right, if they're operating within those constraints and parameters. But I'd love to hear you talk a little bit to that. How does it solve for that? And then maybe what happens if an agent does make a decision for the business that costs millions? How do you make these systems accountable, or who is accountable in those situations?
The agents are ultimately presumably attached to humans that are accountable for their actions. I think, from a governance perspective, rule one is to ensure that the agents that are operating are tied to a person, that the outcomes from that agentic autonomous behavior is going to be a person, a human being that will have that accountability and responsibility to ensure that the outcomes from those systems are conforming to the policy of the company. We can offload the bulk of the effort in that accountability to the agent and the models themselves through the approach that we've just described. If an agent is a program that's got a kind of set of stochastic outcomes and goals and approaches to using a collection of tools, passing context onto other agents, and ultimately leveraging large language models or small language models, it's really about every one of those kinds of elements that is a stochastic aspect of that application being constrained so that it operates in as predictable of a way as you want for that business process that you're executing with that autonomous agent, let's say. And so when you're able to push your model-driven approach into the context engineering, into the fine-tuned language model, maybe you can even train your own model. Maybe you're even implementing a knowledge graph foundation model. I mean, these things are, I would say, on the frontier of what's available to a lot of enterprises. But really, higher-end enterprises can train their own models based on the knowledge graph itself and their corpus of training data that they might have access to about their company and their business. In addition to the open data sets that are available to add world models and those types of kind of broader information and knowledge bases. And so to me, it's like you want to layer the implementation of this approach as deeply as you need to in order to ensure that your outcomes are within the bounds of your risk tolerance. And the more that you can avoid offloading differentiated value to the large language model itself, and hopefully you wrote a really great prompt and your context engineering has enough detail so that the outcomes of that is going to be different. If I just copy pasted that as another company and swap names, am I taking your IP? Possibly. So you want to maybe protect your IP and employ portions of your IP through this approach into every layer of your AI ops when it comes to selecting your model, training your model, fine-tuning your model, using that model within an AI agent, having the agent be aware of the constraints through the agentic context and prompt engineering itself, and then ultimately adding the additional controls to the whole process to make sure the outcomes are right. So having agents that are monitoring other agents and the outcomes of those agents is a pattern that I've seen that seems to be an excellent one as well.
Yeah, I think multi-agent orchestration and kind of the checks and balances across that is something I'm also seeing happen a lot more in the industry. You said one thing that was so simple, yet so powerful to me, which is tying accountability for an agent to a human. Yes. Ultimately, if we think about this as software delivering work, there are people managing employees, there are people managing those agents or accountable for those agents. And I think that's such a simple idea that could go so far in terms of creating accountability and some level of governance within an organization. So,
exactly.
I think sometimes the simplest statements are the most important ones. And that was one that really stuck out to what you just said.
Well, and I've been spending time really digging into the world of decentralized AI, where there is anonymity as a kind of rule. But even in that space, some of the clients we're working with are building AI agents that do crypto trading for you autonomously. And for you to have this agent operating with your wallet, making trades on your behalf, ultimately there is a need to have that human tied to it in order to know your customer and to comply with the different rules within the jurisdictions within which that agent is operating. But there is that kind of counterbalanced force of this anonymity that lives within this crypto Web3 world that makes this a challenge, a tough sell to some organizations. But I think that's another aspect of the nano governance concept that I've been espousing. It's really, the ultimate traceability of those individual controls should go up to a person that is accountable for the implementation of that control, whether it's your chief risk officer, by way of senior management, middle management, and the AI agent team ultimately that deployed and takes cares and manages the agent deployment all the way down into the individual selections within the application itself, the tools that are being used by the agents, and all the way down. And ultimately, that traceability is something that I think is lacking. And it's not impossible. It just requires thoughtful implementation and I would say centralized view of risk management and governance when it comes to AI governance. And governance is the implementation of your ethics, of your policies, of your regulation constraints. So to me, it's like governance is elemental, and you also have to have a AI ethics position and implement governance to govern those ethical boundaries within which your processes are operating.
And as you are building these systems for companies, what's typically the biggest mistake that you're seeing them make when they're implementing these systems?
Well, ultimately they don't have the knowledge of their own strategy enough to be able to build the knowledge graph. I mean, it's really a self-knowing challenge to understand their own differentiated value proposition to a level of sophistication to be able to model it. I think there's like just the basics of who are we, what do we do, and how do we operate? What markets are we in, and what is our value proposition within the operational structure of how we operate? And to take the time to model all of that, especially if you model it using ontologies that are based on different international standards and domain ontologies, you'll really see what the difference is. The differentiated value pops out. And when you're able to get through that self-knowing process, you can really press the gas on differentiation and value, ultimately driving more value to your customers to really understand, what separates you and the humans that are operating your organization and from another collection of humans that might have access to the same technology. And so I think that, that initial step of self-knowing is really crucial. Ultimately, it's a lack of maturity in strategy development and strategy modeling that I've seen. A lot of large enterprises operate their strategy using PowerPoint, which is ultimately not necessarily systemizable easily, and there's a kind of mad dash to gather the appropriate KPIs and OKRs and other elements to demonstrate alignment of strategy to operations. And those that are more mature in their use of strategy modeling tools, they're able to really implement things that in parallel that ultimately can transform them much faster, and they'll be more nimble and more agile. One of my favorite technologies was an enterprise architecture modeling technology called True. It got bought by PlanView, and it allows for you to implement robust strategy models and ultimately create the traceability to every single project or operational process that you have going in your organization. Were you able to take such a model and present it to and use it as a set of data that you can fine tune your language models with or control and create constraints with? You're going to have a lot more power in your organization and to ultimately reflect your business strategy into the systems themselves. But that's a lot to ask for, a line of business that's got this, urgent CEO sponsored, we must become AI first by next quarter or my job's on the line. And so there's a lot of really scurrying that's going on, and instead of thoughtful models and developments. So,
That's such a fascinating insight into, what you just touched on, which is the trade-offs between short-term outcomes and long-term strategic advantage, right? And the fact that we're rarely set up for that long-term strategic advantage. But even what you said about this process of building the knowledge graph as a process of self-knowing and almost reflection, right? I think one of the things that humans are very bad at and that organizations are even worse at is logical reasoning, like thinking through the application of your policies and your beliefs to any particular environment. And so there are so many paradoxes and contradictions that exist within our own brains, but also within an organization's governance frameworks and policies and how they try to bring technologies to market, let alone the understanding of what their truly differentiated value is to their customers. And I find it so fascinating the way that you talk through that, because I know that from our experience, even at my previous company at Elemental Cognition, there's what's written on paper and the coded knowledge within an organization that you can feed into language models and build ontologies off of. But then there's frequently, when you go to operationalize that, there are the humans that are well, actually, that's not what we really do in that situation. We do this. And the humans have all of this tacit knowledge about how to address it.
Yeah.
Which makes it hard.
It does. And I think that's where you have to rely on human in the loop, and ensure that those individuals with tacit knowledge are first and foremost retained and treated respectfully, because they often have the keys to the kingdom when it comes to how you are differentiated and how you operate. And encouraging them and those with tacit knowledge to codify that knowledge as much as possible is a challenge. And part of this is really giving them the accountability to do those encoding of as much of their tacit knowledge as possible by encouraging that self-knowing aspect of it. One of my colleague, Dave Dugal, who has an amazing AI company called Enterprise Web, he's really coined a term called GraphOps. So graph operations, to me, is kind of like the psychiatrist coming in, working with individuals across domains with tacit knowledge and sharing the excitement of them being able to see their knowledge reflected in the graph in such a way as to have that graph be more and more accurate, to carve out aspects of the processes that are going to be purely humanized and not technologically modelable, and to reflect as much as you can that can be modeled. And that way we can really differentiate what is the real human aspects of the business from what can be automated. And that's, I think, a process, maybe a techno future business process that isn't quite mainstream yet, but really how we can help individuals have less fear about AI when they understand that the goal is to get more human out of them, to get more aspects of what's human into the processes so that they're doing the human aspects more so than the kind of mechanistic aspects of the roles or jobs that they're within. And almost every automation initiative, whether you're using AI or not, is freeing up time, presumably, to do either more mechanistic things or to do more human things. I think with AI, the goal is to free up as much time as possible to focus as much as possible on the human aspects of the role, those body known and learned things that only tacit knowledge can really execute on. There's going to be a significant percentage of those parts of jobs that we'll want to emphasize and double down on so that individuals can become even higher quality humans at those aspects of their jobs. So when we talk about things like, let's just take an example of like onboarding into any sort of system like a bank. There's quite a lot that an AI can do, but when a human comes in, they're really creating a dynamic, personalized relationship with their voice and their face if it's video, and incorporating the knowledge they have. Maybe the AI is feeding them the knowledge, but they're incorporating it in a natural human way to drive a natural human conversation that gets to understand each other as people and drives deeper into the kind of common human needs that all humans have, and kind of sees you as another person looking to achieve the outcomes from that onboarding process, that safety of having a bank there for you, holding your assets, as an example. And so you'll be able to kind of retain those customers more when you have a higher degree of human to human connection with them, presumably. And so the idea that AI would maybe streamline the process of data gathering and some of the mechanistic aspects of learning about a customer's background and give you that kind of cheat sheet as a banker, but your job is to really translate that into a real-time conversation. Don't read a script, absorb it and be present and be human and really understand the fundamental human needs that are being satisfied by this banking experience that your company is delivering.
You touched on something that I've heard many people say on this show, but that I think is so key, which is that it's an opportunity to be more human. And at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff is change management process. And the biggest fear that you will come across is what you mentioned, right? People don't want to encode all of their tacit knowledge and then lose their jobs and be kind of automated away. But there is a lot of work on the part of the organization, a lot of responsibility to bring that different framing, that different view of like, let's encode this knowledge to free you from the mechanistic aspects, and let's help you become more human and focus on the things that you are, most, that are most satisfying, that are most human, that are most creative. It's going to be difficult because obviously people are seeing AI take jobs. There's a lot of fear mongering in the news. There's a lot of hype from the AI model providers as well. So I think it's a space in which it's difficult to have that nuanced conversation. but hopefully one that more organizations can have. Before we go, I'd love to ask you, one last question. If you could mandate kind of one AI governance practice that every company implements by 2026, what would that one practice be?
They should have an AI governance framework that is mandatory for all AI projects, that has the right individuals at the table to ensure that any AI system that uses large language models that has anything to do with any sort of medium to high risk business activity goes through that process. Just like an architectural review board should be there, an AI governance organization should be there as well. And companies like Microsoft and others have dismantled that in order to kind of accelerate outcomes for AI. I think that there's a lot of business value to having it. It creates a level playing field for the individuals that are accountable for the outcomes, be they good or bad, from these systems. And it brings more of their creative input to the table. I think they might need to position it in such a way as to, score it and measure its outcomes of this governance organization in order to encourage a creative application of solutions that ultimately reduce risk, but also allow for upside risk of things that you didn't even account for. Those governance organizations might identify, hey, what if this really takes off and we haven't, put enough infrastructure in place to account for it. And, we get slow response times because we don't have enough GPUs allocated, and ultimately, pushes on upside risk and downside risk on outcomes. I think that's key. You have to have these things in place. You have to make them mandatory. You want to push them down as deeply into the organization as you can, and have as many individuals that are accountable for outcomes involved and at the table.
Yeah, that's a good governance practice, is to have a governance org in the first place. Yeah. I think that's a good place to start.
It's just a separate org, though. To me, it's like it's embedded. Governance is about bringing different people together from different parts of the org on a common mission to execute the strategy as effectively and efficiently as possible within the constraints of your regulatory and other commitments. And so it's not just like the chief compliance officer's responsibility. It's they might be the sponsor of the governance organization, but they're really bringing everybody together across the business. And then those leaders need to push it down into their individual business units systematically in a way that operationalizes it. And maybe the compliance leader helps with the tooling and the approach to do that. But without that collective effort, then you're going to really be missing out, and you'll get shadow AI like there is in a lot of organizations that are ultimately creating risk for your enterprise in a way that you might not even know about yet.
Yeah, not just risk in terms of like immediate outcome risk, but IP leakage, like security issues, like all kinds of things.
So many. It's a long list.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's all we have time for today, Nikki. But I really, really enjoyed this. It went in some directions on knowledge graphs and neurosymbolic AI that I wasn't expecting, but that I really loved. And I think you had some great insights to share. If our listeners want to learn more about you and some of the work you're doing, where should they go?
Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I think that's the easiest way to get to me. And I'm happy to interact with anyone. And I have a Calendly on there if you want to meet and have a conversation. I'm there.
Great. That's Nicholas Clarke from Intelagen. So go look him up on LinkedIn, send him a DM after you listen to the episode if you want to start a conversation. Nikki, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it. Thanks to the listeners. Take care.